Sure, it sounds fun, but a road trip could be a ride straight to hell. This world is a strange one. I, for one, am a big fan of road trips. Whether I'm driving or getting motion sickness in the back seat from reading stuff on my phone for too long, a road trip can be relaxing and fun, especially when you see new places. But new places can also mean new dangers. You're exposing yourself to strange places, strange people, and not in the sexy way. And the only protection you have from people that really are exposing themselves is the thin plastic and metal of a car. So if you think you can survive, let's stop by the gas station first and grab some beef jerky for the ride. Sounds like a good last meal to me. Enjoy these allegedly true road trips from hell. But first, have you had a creepy experience with cops, or are you a cop who's had a terrifying moment on the job? I would love to read your story. Also, I'd love to hear some more creepy McDonald's stories if you've got them. Just send them over to us at darknessprevails.org, and we might just feature them in a new video. Or visit our submission page and check out all the stories that we're looking for. Thank you in advance. Now, I call shotgun. Literally, I get to hold the shotgun. Because I think I saw something lurking just outside the window. Number 1. Gas Station Stalker. Submitted by Aiden A. One day, me, my dad, and my dad's girlfriend and her 2 boys went to the coast of Oregon to spend time with my grandparents for Christmas vacation. The trip was a complete disaster, so we left early. On the long road trip back, we stopped at a gas station to grab some snacks for the ride. Now, when I saw the place had extra hot Cheetos and pizza pockets, I went right for the Cheetos first. Then I went up to the cashier for my pizza pocket. And almost immediately I noticed the guy behind the counter. He was pale, sweating, and his mouth was slightly open the whole time. He seemed so nervous and twitchy. Could I get 2 pizza pockets, please? I asked. This only seemed to bother him more. I don't know if he was on edge, or if he was always like this, but it really creeped me out. He gave me my food and I paid for my snacks. Thanks, I said hesitantly, and I walked out of there. I couldn't walk away fast enough, to be honest, but that was not the last time I saw that man. Later down the road on our trip back, we were in a traffic jam. We didn't know what had happened up ahead, but traffic was at a dead crawl. We were all just sitting there in the car, silent, trying to pass the time in our own ways. Suddenly there's this loud crash right next to me, and before I know what's happening, something grabs hold of my arm and begins to pull me out of the window. At this point, I'm kicking and I'm screaming. Honestly, I've never been so surprised in my life. And almost immediately, that surprise was replaced with fear. I had no idea what was happening. I grabbed hold of the seat in front of me, and I could see my family's faces contort in fear and anger. Sure enough, I wasn't the only one screaming. I watched as my dad jumped out of the car. He ran up behind me and began to hit the assailant. Then, whoever it was, released my arm, and I turned around. And there, in the middle of the road, surrounded by traffic-jammed cars, my dad was in a struggle with the man from the gas station. All I can remember thinking was, what the hell? What did he want? And why would he follow us all this way? Apparently, he had busted the window to the car and yanked me out of it. Or at least tried to. I don't know what he was thinking doing this in broad daylight with people everywhere. The man broke away from my father and then disappeared between the cars. The cops were called and we all filed reports. Beyond that, I don't know what came of him. As for the rest of that day, no one said a word on the way home after that. But I can say that I hope this man is in jail. Because if he's not, who's to say he won't try this on someone else? And who knows what his plan would have been had he succeeded in kidnapping me. Number 2. The Ghost Light. Submitted by Chris. Let me begin by saying that this is based on an actual paranormal spot in southeast Arkansas. I have only been there once when I was visiting my aunt in Crossett many years ago. The legend begins in the early 1900s, when all Crossett was known for was its decent railroad track. The tracks spanned all across the county and even reached into the neighboring county. Well, according to legend, one day a man was either drunk, asleep, or dead on the railroad tracks. The men coming down the railroad did not see the man on the tracks until they tragically ran him over. Soon after that, people who lived close to the railroad claimed they would be walking home from work in the dark, and a strange glowing light would be around 20 yards behind them, wherever they went. And of course, in those days, we can't say maybe a streetlight, maybe another car, because at that point in Arkansas, many people didn't even have indoor plumbing, much less streetlights. This phenomenon continued until it became a fun urban legend for kids and teens to investigate in their free time. And to this day, people still drive out there to get a good scare. My story begins when I was 13 years old. I was visiting my aunt in the Deep South. I had never been any further down south than Kansas City, so it was a huge shock. The accents, the trees, the lack of entertainment there. In spite of all this, my aunt tried her best to make it a fun trip for us. My sister and me, that is. However, at 13, your imagination can only take you so far. So one night we were sitting in the living room, just watching TV, when my cousins began to talk about the ghost light. They told me that it was just 4 miles down the road. I found this urban legend amazing. In the city, we never heard of things like that. Haunted dirt roads? I was of course intrigued. My aunt walked into the room as we were talking about it and overheard us. She told us her own stories of going out to see this ghost light. So my cousin Kara and I begged her to take us there. At first, she was hesitant, but she eventually relented and told us to load up in the car. I was so excited. So we did just that. We all loaded up in the car, including my aunt's rat terrier, who went everywhere with her, and headed to see the ghostly light everyone spoke of. She took us a ways down the highway, and then turned down a private paved road by a small airport. And then finally, we headed straight onto an old dirt back road. The worst kind of road for a car. It was exactly how you would imagine driving over a washboard. We came down the road a bit and saw 4 big oak trees with blue paint, and in white a picture of the hangman. Suddenly, my aunt's dog began to growl, but this made it even more interesting, all of us getting creeped out by the dog. We all came out there to see something, and my hopes were definitely up. Besides, the dog probably just saw something in the woods. It was odd nonetheless. Eventually, we hit the end of this road and end up at a 4-way, where you're supposed to turn around and go back the way you came, then park 100 yards away from the turnaround. Sorry if I sound terrible at directions. Anyway, as we parked the car, we turned the engine off, and we flashed our lights. Then we waited patiently in that dark car, in the middle of the dead black woods. At first, we didn't see anything. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw what looked like a green glow. I looked directly at it, and noticed it was waving, almost like in a swinging motion. My aunt then told us that supposedly that green glow is the man who was run over by the train. He was still searching for his head. I shuddered and hoped that maybe it was just a coincidence. Paranormal investigators came here years ago to investigate it, but they claimed it was just gas bubbles from the railroad, she stated. So that's just a gas bubble? I asked, a bit relieved. Oh no, honey, that's the real deal, right there in front of you. Those investigators came and investigated this road and the one down the road. The one down the road is positively gas bubbles. It doesn't move when it's out, she said with no emotion on her face. She continued, when they investigated this road, they found no traces of gas, and they could never get any closer than 70 feet from this thing. I stared ahead, starting to get kind of scared at this point. We continued to watch as the ball of light got larger and brighter, and then suddenly it went out. And a moment later, we saw the skyline light up, and we saw what looked like an approaching car. My aunt turned on the engine, flicked on the lights, and moved up a bit closer to get a better look. We still saw the blinding white light, which looked identical to a car's lights. But it wasn't. After getting to its brightest peak, the car lights slowly faded out, almost like the fade-out option on PowerPoints. It was weird. I was really freaked out at this point, and I could feel my heart pounding. I began getting goosebumps. I was ready to go, but everyone else wasn't. If anything, they were ready for more. My aunt shut off the engine, which I knew instantly was a terrible mistake. My cousins watched intently, waiting on the next side of the light. I looked around at the area I was in, my eyes again adjusting to the darkness. In the woods beside us, I saw what I thought was someone or something walking briskly. But with the windows up, I couldn't see as much and I couldn't hear anything at all. A few moments after that, the light showed itself again. This time it was glowing an orange or yellow color and flickering. I watched, even in fear, praying it wouldn't be a serious thing. Then seconds after that, my aunt's dog began to go crazy. She started barking and crying at the same time, jumping from seat to seat. As my eyes were following her, I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. I remember thinking to myself, "Oh God." The thing turned crimson red and was not moving from side to side or flickering anymore. It was now flying, shooting down the dirt road, heading straight for our car. I panicked, and so did my aunt, because she hurried to turn the engine on. Sadly, that never works out, does it? Because the car would not start. We were all panicking. My cousin Kara started crying as my aunt frantically tried to start the engine. This creepy red light was a mere 30 feet away from our car, and it was huge. It looked like a supermoon overshadowing our windshield, highlighting the dashboard and the terrified face of my aunt. We sat there a moment, realizing the car was not going to start, and that thing was only a few feet away. So we just stared and waited for our impending doom. It stood still. It would not move or budge. It just stood there, the big red blob. The car began to shake a bit, and then there was silence. Then it would shake a little bit harder, and we all began screaming again. It felt like something was trying to pick up the car. My aunt tried again and again to turn over the engine, but the thing was completely dead, which absolutely made no sense. The car was still shaking, and we saw that the light still hadn't moved. It was just sitting there. It felt like it was staring into our souls. Finally, after several minutes, the car cranked itself back to life, and my aunt swung on the headlights and floored it. When the lights came on, we saw a good outline of our harasser, and I will never forget what I saw. The red light was still ever so red, but within it, I saw the outline of a woman carrying a lantern. It was the lantern glowing red. As my aunt sped down the road, the blob still did not move or give chase. My aunt drove straight through the red fog on the woman. The red enveloped the car as we drove through her, and the last thing I saw was the outline of her creepy smile. We made it home safe, but we all were kind of silent for the rest of the night. And I never visited that town again. I can't say I would want to. I still see my aunt and cousins for the holidays, but it's far away from that portal to hell. And when I see them, I can't help but think about that short nighttime road trip that we all regret. I don't know if anyone has heard of this place, but it's probably the scariest thing I've ever seen. I still see that faded red smile, that crooked, sadistic smile. Number 3. Skinwalkers are out there. Submitted by Aaron F. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It's a fairly large city, and right down the middle runs the Rio Grande River, and the river feeds a small forest that runs along it. We call this forest the Basque. There are some really unusual and creepy things that occur in the Basque. One of these creepy things is the Shroom House. It's this old adobe house that's been there through the ages. We call it the Shroom House because there are mushrooms spray painted all over the thing. I've been there a couple of times during the day, but I've never met someone who's been there during the night. One night, however, I can say that I'm that person, along with my friends who went with me. The night started off with me and Michaela. I picked her up, and immediately we began to smoke to forget the day's labor. I call up my friend Matt, and both I and Michaela agreed to join Matt at his house. There we meet 2 of his neighbors. Honestly, I can't remember their names, just know they were with us. We were playing pool and just trying to catch up. It must have been 12 midnight by then. We got bored and none of us were tired, so I had the brilliant idea to go on a road trip to the Shroom House to see if we can smoke some weed there and creep each other out. With no objections, we hop in my red Mazda 6 and head to the Basque. I turn off the main road and onto a side road, and then a dirt one, and then finally pull into a dirt parking lot. The more dirt on the road, the closer we were getting. This dirt parking lot is pretty big, and on the north side is a chain-link fence that separates the dense vegetation from the dirt road. The fence follows the parking lot halfway, and then turns into a 2-foot-high wooden beam that lines the parking lot. Where the chain-link fence ends is a small animal trail that leads to the end of a small dugout ditch. If you carefully cross that ditch without getting caught by the vegetation in your face, you follow another animal trail that finally leads you to the Shroom House. When I put my vehicle in park, we all jump out excitedly and stop at the animal trail. Who's got a flashlight? I look up and the moon is full and everything is well lit up. I have a lighter, I said. Obviously, we were all chatty and having a good time, and we said a whole lot more than I'm writing here. Anyway, I crouched down and start crawling through the animal trail with the lighter in front. My friends were behind me. I make it to the dugout ditch and hop down. I look to my left and my friends decide to walk the rim of this ditch. We all kind of stopped, looking around us for the trail that leads to the house, when we suddenly hear it. Now, the ditch goes off perpendicular from the animal trail we were on. I was in the ditch with the lighter in hand. We could hear a small animal shuffling through the vegetation about 30 feet from the ditch. We could hear the small animal making small little steps. We didn't think much of it when we realized it wasn't running away in fear from us. Whatever it was seemed to be pacing back and forth. All of a sudden, those small little animal steps turned into big gaping ones. The thing suddenly sounded heavy, little soft crunches to big heaping footsteps. Now we were all freaking out, and before we knew it, this thing was running toward me in the ditch. Before I could even say it's running towards us, my friends had already started back through the animal trail to my car. Now, even though we were scared and freaking out, we still had to crouch over and crawl through this trail. Otherwise, you would definitely lose an eye trying to full-on sprint through this vegetation. Luckily, we had some distance on this creature, but I could tell from my friends' demeanors that they weren't taking this all too seriously. Weed and liquor will do that to you. But you can be assured that I was sober. They didn't have the pep in their step like I did, and I could still hear this thing full-on sprinting through the woods, and it was getting closer by the second. They were long and strong strides, and as it drew closer, I began to hear this weird, thick, slow breathing. I yelled to my friends in front in a frantic voice to hurry up. With that, my friends chuckling and, oh my gosh, we're having a good time, stroll turned into serious, let's get the heck out of here running. By this time, I could feel this thing right behind me. I pushed my friends along as fast as I could, flicking my lighter and taking a glance behind me. What I saw nearly made me trip. White skin and bare feet. This thing was not crouched over like us. It was straight up barreling through the thick shrubs. Luckily, that was the end of the trail and we were all jumping in my car within seconds. Before me and Matt get in, however, we take a second look back to see if we were being followed still. It wasn't, so me and Matt decided to walk up to the chain link fence. It was just 10 feet away from the animal trail that we had just escaped out of. Trying to peer through, we couldn't see much save for leaves and branches, when all of a sudden, like textbook, the thing came crashing against the fence. Without chancing our luck any further, we hopped in my car and sped off. In recollection, I can remember the moon and how bright it was for midnight, but when I was in the ditch, I remember how freaking pitch black it was. It was as if someone turned out the moon, if that makes any sense. Anyway, that's my story. I can't explain what we saw any more than that, and it will always reverberate in my head. Just what did we see that night? Number 4. A Trip to Savannah. Submitted by Ginger Cat. I've traveled to many places, but my trip to Savannah will always be my most memorable. My friend Mickey and I have always had a love for the supernatural. She loves telling ghost stories, and I've always had a sense for paranormal activity. So when I mentioned I was going to Savannah for my grandma's birthday, a place that's practically crawling with spirits, she was ecstatic. "You have to go on a ghost tour," she yelled happily. "I don't know. I've heard bad stuff can happen on those tours," I nervously replied. "Oh, come on, if you go on one, we'll have more stories to tell," she insisted. "I'll ask Mom," I said. She squealed with excitement. I smiled, but in reality I was scared. Telling stories about the paranormal is fun, but witnessing it is much more terrifying. So the next day I talked to my mom about it. She used to do paranormal investigating, so I figured she would agree. And as I expected, she did. The road trip there was long, maybe 3 or 4 hours. But when we finally got to our hotel, I was practically starving. So we went into a really good restaurant in the hotel and ate. After we finished, we went up to our room to unpack. Now, as a former ghost hunter, I remembered one of my mom's ghost hunting tools. I figured I could at least try to go searching the hotel halls before bed with it, just to make sure I could sleep without being a total chicken. So after asking my mom if I could use it, I grabbed her EMF meter and walked out the door. The halls were completely empty, but still cozy looking. I took a deep breath and began to walk, my eyes staring at the meter. I didn't want to miss a thing. I'd walked 6 doors down until it went from green to yellow to red. Supposedly, green meant the least amount of energy and red being the most. So I did what I always do. I checked for interference. To do that, I pointed it at the walls. The walls were green, the lights were green, and the floor was green. But then I pointed it to the door, and that was red. I walked over to another door and pointed the device at that one, but it was green. I felt confused. Maybe I wasn't using it right. So I went to check the red door again, and I felt a cold pressure on my leg, and a chill ran up my back like a cold breeze. So I started walking back to our room, officially and completely creeped out at that point. But in the middle of the hallway, I stopped because I could feel something like a cold hand on my shoulder. And then I heard a whispered voice in my ear, a voice that was disturbingly clear. "Get out." I froze for a few moments, wondering how I could have possibly heard something after just stepping out into the hallway, something angry at that. So it didn't take me long to grab the meter and dash down the hallway back to our room. I was halfway back to the room, running and out of breath. At one point, I couldn't help but look behind me, and then I heard it again. "Get out!" This time, however, when it spoke, I felt breath against my face. I turned and didn't look back again. When I reached our door, I pounded on it so hard that when my mom opened it, she looked at me like I was crazy. I told her everything that had happened, and luckily she believed me, though she seemed jealous that I had encountered something so quickly. The next day, I was still visibly shaken, but we were still scheduled to go on the tour and we had already paid. My mom convinced me to go and told me that I wouldn't have to actually do anything, so I agreed. I didn't want to ruin my grandma's birthday anyway. Even in going, it turned out to be fun, and I'd almost forgotten everything that had happened the day before. That is, until our tour guide decided to have an EVP session. I thought it would be cool to ask a question. I mean, what were the chances it would actually answer me? Well, I was very surprised. I asked, "Are you in heaven or with God?" When our tour guide played back the tape, the first thing I heard scared the absolute crap out of me. "Do you remember me?" It said so quietly, in a whisper, but it was very clear. It was that same terrifying voice. I began to freak out. Maybe that thing had followed me. When the people around me heard it, I could see the surprise and fear on their faces, and my mom looked excited of all things. All in all, the trip turned out to be the most productive and scary trip I've ever taken. When I got back to school, I told Mickey what happened, and she was happy to have another story to tell. But I told her, I'll tell my stories, but I'm done playing with the paranormal. Supernatural things might seem fun to kids or teenagers, but I hope most of them stay away from supernatural experiences like that. Some people just don't know how dangerous it can be. And number 5, Figure of My Imagination, submitted by Stella Real. I'm 13 years old, and even though I haven't been around that long, that doesn't mean I haven't seen some weird things in my life. I live in a town that's not really known for paranormal activity, but me and my dad have definitely experienced it. Actually, it's hard to choose which story to tell, so I'll tell the most recent. Every year, my family and I would go on a road trip somewhere, normally the same place, for camping during the summer. It's an AA camping trip, along with Alcoholics Anonymous members, and some of my friends would be there. On Halloween, the owners of the campsite would set something up called the Haunted Forest. I never went. I don't know why I didn't. I do have a passion for that kind of scary stuff, but I think it was because of my family, who never really liked that stuff besides my dad. Anyway, on this year, my friends were playing something that I didn't want to do. So I walked out into the woods to explore the unfinished props for the Haunted Forest. There was a maze that I walked through that wasn't really a maze now that I think about it. A police station and a castle in the prop room. I found a giant teddy bear. That wasn't really creepy, actually. Mickey Mouse hands and gloves. A bat with fake nails in it. It was interesting to find this stuff, but in the woods, alone, almost dark, with creepy items around, it was a bit eerie. Anyway, it was getting darker by the moment when I found my friends on the path that led to where I was. They asked me where I had been and said I found a bunch of stuff, so of course they wanted me to show it to them, and I reluctantly agreed to show them. When we reached the prop shed, nothing was missing, but I saw something that apparently my friends did not see. It was on all fours and was the size of a Great Dane. When my friends continued walking, I stayed put. I stepped closer and I saw a black figure. I thought it was a lost dog, for the creature was in the dark, and I couldn't see the nightmares that awaited. I was about to say something to call it over, but the creature stood up slowly, only to reveal that it was a very tall figure, around 9 feet. The creature towered over me, to the point that it looked like I was sitting at the front seats of a movie theater. I was terrified, to the point that I thought I was going to pass out. I couldn't scream because nothing would come out, and the darkness around me made it hard to run without running into something. I couldn't look away from its white pupils that were surrounded by nothing but pitch black. Eventually, the creature walked off. Strange, I know, because I thought I was a goner for sure. After a while just staring off into the distance where the creature had walked into, I did a 180 and walked off. My mind could not wrap itself around the event, but I found myself at the campgrounds in no time. My friends were there, but what was weird was that they were playing at the same game as when I left, like I wasn't even gone. I asked them what they were doing for the time I had left, and they said that they were playing this game the whole time. And what was weird was that it was only 20 minutes since I had walked off. Thank God we were leaving that same day and time, or else I think I would have lost my sanity from the paranoia. It's been almost a year since that road trip to hell, and I'm still very paranoid. I used to have nightmares about me encountering that beast again and dying a gruesome death, but now I can't even get a wink of sleep until the sun comes up, and insomnia doesn't help. Whenever I have a free moment to actually sleep during the day, I can never do it. Before this, I've seen paranormal things, but this was the most vivid thing I could ever remember. No matter how far-fetched or unbelievable this story sounds, I remember the experience very vividly in my head. Don't be overly worried about going outside, doing what you gotta do, or enjoying yourself on the road to your next vacation, because most people don't experience these types of horrors during their everyday lives. But if you do find yourself locked inside your dead car while someone or something outside begins to break the glass, let's just hope it's some guy trying to ask for directions. Oh, who am I kidding? Guys don't do that. It's probably someone trying to kill you. Good night. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And don't forget to send us your police stories and McDonald's stories soon at darknessprevails.org. Thanks.
Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of Storytime. On today's episode, we're going on some road trips with 5 allegedly true stories. If you haven't followed me on my social media yet, then you'll know I just recently went on my own road trip, so I thought as a fun theme, we would go ahead and do some road trip stories. But yeah, other than that, if you haven't checked out my merchandise, then make sure you do that. I've got some awesome designs that I know you're going to love. But with that out of the way, let's get in our cars and let's go ahead and go exploring, shall we? Number 1. Here's a little bit of background information on myself. I'm currently 19 years old and live in a small town in Oregon. This takes place back in the mid 2000s. I decided to go visit my sister, who was living in Pennsylvania at the time. My sister Taylor was a little bit older than me. Well, I say a little bit, but she was 27, and she was already living out on her own. I went to visit her because she had planned on going on a road trip to visit me. It sounded like a fun idea, and I wanted to go as well. I ended up calling her a week before and telling her, "Hi Taylor, since you're gonna be visiting me, why don't I fly over there and stay at your place for a week? That way we can do all the things we want and we can come back together. What do you say?" Wow, you know what? Why didn't I think about that? That's a great idea. I'll go ahead and show you all the sights around here. Then we can go ahead and go on a road trip. Finally, we can go visit some national parks and other landmarks too. From there, we can go back to Oregon. That's what I ended up doing. I left on a Friday afternoon and spent the following week with my sister in Pennsylvania. During that week, we prepared for our road trip while enjoying all the amazing sights in her town. Finally, we started our little vacation. It would soon turn into an experience that we would never forget. We ended up taking the longer route as we went to go visit the Great Lakes first. This was actually something that we wanted to do for a while. From there, we crossed the usual states. We go through Minnesota, North Dakota, and Montana. You bet that we visited a bunch of national parks, and we even took the time to sightsee as well. Some days we chose to stay in the car, and on other nights we chose to stay in small motels. Where this experience takes place, it was somewhere in Montana. We were driving down this deserted looking highway. I'd say it was about 10 p.m. at the time. We were at a point on the road where we barely saw any rest stops. I think the last one we had noticed was about 50 miles away. Another thing we hadn't noticed was we hadn't seen another car in a long time. The last time we saw a car was about an hour ago. We wanted to find a place to rest since it was getting late, but we hadn't seen any signs for a stop in a while. Also, it's worth mentioning that a lot of these stops weren't really towns. They were more like places that you could fill up your car and buy some snacks at a small little convenience store. By this point, we're both pretty tired and looking to stop somewhere for the night. If you've ever driven for hours at a time, it can get pretty boring, even when you switch every few hours. As we continue driving, we're hoping to find an exit so we can rest. Finally, we can see a sign that tells us there's a rest stop in a few miles. After what seemed like forever, we finally see the exit and start making our way down this lonely road. I'll admit, me and my sister were pretty nervous. As we're leaving the highway, we're also leaving behind what little light source we had. There were a few lights on the highway, but out here now, it was completely dark. The thing is, we needed to fill up our car, so we really had no choice. This area honestly looked abandoned. It was like your typical place in a suspenseful movie. The only source of light we had seen was from the station up ahead of us. Even then, the lights themselves were pretty dim. They kept turning on and off every 20 to 30 seconds. As we're approaching, we only saw 2 cars parked. One was out in front, the other was to the side of this little building. When we arrived, we cautiously looked through the windows before exiting. Slowly, we walk up to the doors and open them. You can hear the sound of the little bell as the doors opened, and we are welcomed with a cool air conditioning. At the front counter was an older-looking man who welcomed us inside. He seemed friendly enough and even offered us a free cup of coffee. "Good evening. It's nice to have some visitors this late at night. Here, have some coffee on the house. So, what can I help the two of you with?" "Oh, well, we just needed to fill up our car, that's all." "Hey, do you know whose car's on the side of the building?" He seemed confused about it. He told us he had no idea whose car that was. "Well, if I had a guess, it's probably just someone that decided to camp out here for the night, that's all." I guess it did make sense. We thank him for everything and we pay him. From there we exit and start walking back outside. I so happened to look to the corner and noticed a little light inside the car was turned on. Inside, I saw what looked to be two people who just sat there staring at us. I didn't mind them in that moment, but I did find it weird. We quickly fill up the car, then get back inside to leave. As we start exiting this small station, my sister points to something in the rearview mirror. "Wait a minute, is that car following us? Weren't they just parked back at the station like a second ago?" Yes, it was weird. They didn't even have their lights on anymore. I put the window down, and sure enough, I could hear this car following us. It was really just this old suspicious-looking van. As we keep going down this lonely road, they are now starting to get closer. It got to the point where they were literally bumping into us, trying to force us to stop. I tell my sister to get on the phone and call officers. There were a couple of things wrong with this though. 1, we didn't even know how to tell them where we were. 2, when my sister tried calling, there was really bad cell phone reception. We were in between a mountain area, so getting a phone call out here was near impossible. We are now on the highway going faster, and they are doing the same. Over the course of the next 20 minutes, we are just on high alert, as this vehicle is driving in a very strange manner. At one point, they manage to get right next to us. I see as one of them in the passenger seat pulls down the window. Obviously, these two were up to no good. Again, they try to bump into us, but I sped up just in time. This caused them to almost lose control. This continued on for a little more, until we noticed red and blue lights in our rearview mirror. I guess while that was happening, an officer that was parked on the side of the highway happened to see what the van was doing to us. In that moment, the van pulls off the highway and onto the desert area. From there, the officer follows him. We take this opportunity to keep on driving. Initially, we were pretty tired, but I guess with the mix of coffee and adrenaline, we kept on driving for another couple of hours. Finally, we actually found a small motel where we ended up stopping for the night. We never did find out more about what happened. We woke up the next morning obviously shaken, but we soon tried to forget about it over breakfast. Thankfully, we made it to Oregon without any more occurrences. Me and my sister will never forget that night. I'm actually planning on going on a road trip with my kids soon, but I think that this time we'll choose to avoid old abandoned rest stop areas, at least for now. Number 2. This story took place back in the 1990s. What better story than being lost in the middle of nowhere, am I right? Here's how it goes. I still remember it because it was a cold and rainy day. Yeah, typical. I was on a road trip delivering some things for my mom and my dad. I'd moved about 8 hours away from home about a month ago. Of course, as it turned out, my mom had left some important documents in one of the drawers of furniture. Normally, I could have just mailed it back, but it does give me an excuse to go on a road trip. Besides, I had planned on doing one for a while. Along the way was a national park that I wanted to visit, so I figured I would go ahead and visit it on the way back. I didn't want to deal with traffic, so I ended up leaving in the late afternoon. I would go ahead and pull a late-night drive and arrive early the next morning. Remember that this was during a time when GPS wasn't really something you would see in cars, and with no cell phone, it did make calling for help impossible. It was around 1 in the morning and I was on a stretch of road that was pretty much in the middle of nowhere. With the added rain and a light mist, It made it very difficult to see around me. Also, the light from my car barely provided any assistance due to the rainy conditions. Another thing I noticed was there were no cars. I mean, I haven't seen one in miles. I'd been following the highway for the most part, but with the difficult conditions I mentioned, I may have misread one of the signs. Now it seemed like I was driving into this very desolate and quiet wooded area. The road still continued on, so I figured I would just continue on and see if I met up on another highway I could take. Although I did have a map with me, it was difficult to follow. Looking back, relying on a small little map from one of those 99-cent stores wasn't exactly my best idea. Next time, I'll make sure to invest in a larger, better quality map. Still, from what I could read, it showed this road continued north, which I needed to go to anyways. If anything, this acted sort of like a shortcut, so I guess this was a good idea. Not exactly, though. Another 10 minutes, and I can see a crossroads in the middle of the road. This was confusing. There wasn't any indication of a crossroads on the map. Either this map wasn't updated in a while, or this was new. I took my chances and chose to go down one of these roads. The further I went down, the worse quality the road was becoming. Now it was more of a dirt road and not so much pavement. It was becoming obvious I was lost. As I make a turn around a bend, I can see a house up in the distance, right in the middle of the woods. When my headlights shine on the house, it looked to be abandoned. Some of the windows were destroyed and the front yard was dirty. I did see a car there, so I thought maybe somebody was home. Hey, it was a possibility, right? The road is coming to an end here, so left with no other options, I start turning my car around to prepare to go back. As I'm doing so, my car gets stuck in the mud. Great. At this point, it had been pouring like crazy, and thus making it difficult for my car to function. I happen to look through my rearview mirror, and I see my car was indeed stuck. What happens next makes me so thankful the car had gotten free. When I did look in the rearview mirror, I saw what looked to be a couple of shadows moving near the house. Of course, with the lighting, I just assumed I was seeing things. I paid closer attention, and now I started realizing that there was a couple walking over to my car. Another thing I noticed was what sounded like barking. I now see as a dog is heading over to my car, barking like there is no tomorrow. Immediately I locked my car, concerned on what these two were up to. Soon I'm hearing the dog scratching at my door, desperately trying to get to me. It was now that I can see the couple better. They looked old and had dirty clothing on. Assuming they lived out here, I was really starting to begin to lose it. One of them was holding what looked to be a shovel, and the other a crowbar. On the inside, I'm just screaming, hoping my car will get going, but it won't move. I suddenly hear a very loud noise behind the car, and I can see as the person with the shovel is hitting the side of my car. It seemed like now my car got the brilliant idea to get going, because now my car was moving. I joke about it looking back now, but I always tell myself that by them doing that, it convinced my car to get going. As I'm driving away, I can see them running back to the house. Finally, I thought this was the end. I could finally get out of there and go back to the main highway. There is no way I was going to take a chance and go down the other path. I was still trying to be careful not to get my car stuck again until I made it back to the paved section of road. This, of course, made it difficult to go faster. Soon, I'm seeing headlights in the distance. Now I realize these two are coming after me. I freeze on the inside as I realize they aren't done just yet. They are now getting closer to me, and I can see the crossroads ahead of me. Due to all the commotion and confusion, I forgot which side I had entered from. The thing is, I couldn't just stop there and have a cup of tea and try to remember which road it was. I had to make a choice right there and then. I go for one of the roads and I don't look back. Thankfully, I'm soon seeing familiar lights up in the distance. It was the main highway. As I'm now exiting this wooded area, I can see through the rearview mirror that they had stopped completely. The last thing I remember seeing was them turning around and going back the way they had come from. I was so relieved I was finally out of that mess. By now it's almost 2 in the morning, but I finally did see a couple of cars. Another great thing was that the rain had finally stopped, and the mist from earlier was going away. Now that I was able to read the signs correctly, I stay with the other cars until eventually I see a stop for a small town. It's 3 a.m. at this point, and I desperately needed a break. I turn off onto the off-ramp, but I noticed this time there was plenty of lighting. No more woods, no more middle of nowhere, just a large town with plenty of lights. I do make it to a small little station where I was finally able to check my car. Sadly, there was a large dent on the side of the car from earlier. I would later get this fixed. I walked inside the convenience store and ended up mentioning what had happened to me to the cashier. He laughed about it a little bit and then told me, "Yes, you need to be more careful which roads you take. A lot of people live out here in the middle of nowhere and they're not exactly too friendly. You should consider yourself lucky." Thanks for pointing out the obvious. I paid for my things and ended up staying in a small little motel. After everything I'd gone through that night, I really wasn't in the mood for driving. I woke up at around 9 a.m., then continued on until I made it to my parents' house. Obviously, my parents wanted to know where the dent came from, so I ended up telling them too. In the end, I chose not to go to the national park, and instead, I left my car with my parents. To return home, I ended up buying a plane ticket. My parents got the car fixed for me and sold it for me. They sent me the money and I ended up buying a nicer car. Still, one of the more concerning moments in my life, but I did get a new car out of it in the end, so I guess that was a good thing. Number 3. This occurred back in the early 2000s when I went on a road trip with my friend Robin. I'll give you some background information to lead up to what happened. Both of us were avid photographers, and we're really into taking pictures of the wilderness. We spent many hours building our portfolios with pictures from the mountains, the woods, and the ocean. Something we really haven't done was go into the desert and take pictures of the landscapes out there. With that mindset, we planned on taking a trip to Utah. Utah, for those who don't know, is well known for its state parks and beautiful deserts. So with that, we both ended up planning our next trip. We were both working different schedules, so getting vacation at the same time did take a while. Finally, after about a month, we both were able to get the same time off. It was set. We left our town in California at around 5 in the morning and started our week-long adventure. We proceeded to enjoy miles of driving and singing along to our favorite songs. Yes, I know, lame, but it's how we pass the time. After making a few stops here and there, we arrived later that afternoon. You can imagine after driving all that time, we were both pretty tired. After getting some sleep, our next plan was to go camping out in the desert. Before leaving our little hotel, we make a stop at a little convenience store. That's where we could go pick up some food and other essentials. After that, we get in a rented trailer and start making our way over to the state park that was shown on our map. When we arrived, we get to this area where one can stop and park their cars. One thing we did notice was this road that we could follow that would take us out further into the desert. We really didn't feel like walking all the way out there, and so we would drive along until we found a spot to camp. Something that came to my attention was this dark unmarked van that was parked in that area. It was the only car there, and it was the only one we had seen the entire time. As me and Robin were driving out into the desert, we noticed it started following us. We did find it strange that it had been doing this, but after a while they turned to the side and drove off into the distance. Weird, but just remember that van will come into play later on in the story. We kept on going for about 10 minutes until we're essentially out in the middle of nowhere. Around us there were miles and miles of desert with the occasional small trees. Out here as well, we were able to see all these beautiful natural rock formations, sort of like the ones we'd seen in movies and read about in books. At this point, it's around noon, and so we decided to stop by one of these rock formations. It provided natural shade, which would work wonders for us. As soon as we arrived, we take the opportunity to set up our small little campsite. Once we get everything ready, it's now about 3 in the afternoon. We were pretty hungry, so we ended up starting to get some food going. We had brought some ramen with us, and so we ended up making that for food. It was fast and easy, which was nice. Once done, we sat around for another couple of hours. At around 5 p.m., we decided now that it was the perfect time to explore. The weather was cooling off, and we wanted to take pictures before it got too dark. Once we closed up our trailer and put everything away, we head on off into the desert. We walked for about another 15 minutes until we arrived at this small little canyon. Here we had the option of walking down and going into this small little valley. We could see a nice little river down there with various neat rock formations that we hadn't seen where we camped. With there only being a little bit of sunlight left, we start making the way down these narrow winding trails. I should go ahead and give you a quick description of these trails. Like I mentioned, they were pretty narrow, and they required us to be careful. Since the trails twist and turn around the canyon, you couldn't actually see what was ahead of you. While going around one of these bends, we start to hear footsteps. We both froze, thinking we had first heard our own footsteps. The steps ended up stopping as soon as we did. When we continue walking, we end up running into this older-looking man. He just stood there. It was strange. It was in the 80s, and he was wearing winter clothing. I don't think that's something you would wear. Obviously, we should have just turned around there and then, but we decided to continue forward. The man continues to stare at us as we walk on by. I hadn't seen it, but my friend Robin tells me something as we're making our way down. "What's wrong, Robin? Don't tell me it was that man. Come on, don't worry about it. I'm sure he was just some random person out here. He must be exploring just like us." "No, it's not that." "All right, then, what is it then?" "It's just that when I turned around, he kept on looking at us, almost like he was enjoying that we were nervous." You can imagine my reaction to hearing that. Here we are in the middle of nowhere with this stranger. We had no idea why he would be out here. Another thing we started thinking were all these stories about people going missing. Even with all that going on in our minds, we didn't want to leave just yet because he could have possibly been waiting for us or even hiding. Who knows, he could have had something with him. We were stuck. We aren't familiar with this area, so it's not like we had any other options. When we finally did make it to the bottom of the valley, we can get a better view of the canyon above us. We ended up skipping out on taking pictures, and now our main priority was finding another way up. With the nighttime slowly approaching, time was running out. With little to no light, we wouldn't want to be out here. Robin points out a trail that she saw that seemed to go back up to the canyon. It appeared to be a little further down the trail, but our hope was that it was far enough from our encounter. What other option did we have? All we had with us was a camera and a couple of water bottles. What were we going to do? Throw them at him? Moving on. We walk down the banks of this river until we can see a path that goes up. We now start making our way up carefully, looking for any signs of movement. Me and Robin once again start hearing movement, and we're thinking the worst. It turned out to be a couple of birds that were moving around in the trees. Eventually, we did make it to the top with no signs of our stranger friend. This trail wasn't too far off from where we originally descended, and so we didn't have to worry about walking too much. The only issue was that at this point, we only had about, I'd say, 30 minutes of sunlight left. With little light left and this walk ahead of us, we waste no time. By this point, we had tried our best to ignore what had happened earlier until we can see our trailer. The only thing now was that there was something else we saw. Remember that unmarked van we had seen earlier in the day? Well, now it was conveniently parked close to our campsite. Instantly, we put two and two together. We weren't about to just walk over there. Even if they welcomed us with cake and flowers, we wouldn't dare go there. Instead, we ended up hiding behind some rocks and watching for a while. By now, it's dark and we had no source of light with us. Eventually, our eyes adjusted to the lighting and we could see a little bit better. The van just sat there with its lights on until we can see them turn it off. From there, we both watched as two people stepped out and started walking over to our trailer. We couldn't really see what was going on, but it seemed like they were trying to make their way inside. We watched as they kicked at the trailer door, but they were unsuccessful. After what seemed like an eternity, they get inside their van and start driving away. That was really strange, but we didn't want to stay out here any longer. When we noticed we no longer saw the van, we quickly make our way over to the trailer. With our key, we now get inside and start making our way out of there. Both of us thought about how strange this day was and couldn't really begin to imagine how much worse it was going to get. Eventually, we started to notice something was wrong with our trailer. We ended up pulling off to the side of the highway, and when we got out, we noticed a bunch of marks in our tires. Here we can hear the sound of air coming out. Now, these marks weren't just from any random rocks or something. This was done by someone. That's when we started thinking about the two from earlier. I'm sure they were the ones that did it. With no cell phone, we walked about half a mile until we found one of those call boxes. We called AAA and they ended up sending somebody to help us out. The man that arrived took one look at the tires, and he confirmed that this indeed had been done by someone. It couldn't have been done by the road. Looking back on all of this, I really do wonder what those two were up to. Had we been inside the trailer, who knows? Either way, we never did see them again. Number 4. This happened a few years ago. I'd gone on a road trip with my then girlfriend Alexis. She's now my wife. Anyways, we drove for about 2 hours to go to an amusement park we'd always wanted to visit. It was her birthday, and I promised as a birthday gift we would end up going. On a Friday morning, we made the 2-hour trip north until we had arrived in town. Here we checked into a hotel and we proceeded to enjoy the day there. We wanted to spend that Friday at this nice fancy hotel before dedicating Saturday to the amusement park. At the hotel, we spent some time in the pool and even at the spa. At night, we enjoyed a wonderful buffet of seafood and other delicacies. Saturday morning, we woke up and we proceeded to head on over to the park. As you might imagine, it was pretty busy that day. There was a water park inside, and that's where we ended up spending the majority of the afternoon. Finally, having our fill of the park, we ended up going back to the hotel to rest. We were going to spend Sunday there as well, but I ended up getting a call from my boss. Hey, I know this is last minute, but I'm going to need you to come into work Monday morning. We have a lot of things we need to take care of, and I want everybody here to help out. It was a bummer. We wanted to spend another day out here, but work was important. Alexis understood and said we could return now if we wanted to. I worked at an office that handled paperwork, and I knew I needed at least a day to get everything ready. A bit disappointed, I'll admit, but we ended up leaving the hotel at around 8 p.m., and were soon on the road at around 8:30. I didn't mention this earlier, but I will now. When you drove into town, you were surrounded by people and traffic. Even just being 10 minutes outside of town, you were pretty much in the middle of nowhere. All around us were just fields and deserts. On top of that, we hadn't really seen any cars on our way here. Now at nighttime, there was even less traffic. Still, even with that, Alexis puts our address on her phone, and we start heading back the way we had arrived. Going back, we had to go up this desolate and quiet mountain road with woods on both sides. It wasn't as bad when we drove here, but at nighttime, with literally the only light from our car, It was a bit eerie. As I was busy driving, I didn't notice this one important detail. Alexis was actually the one that pointed it out to me. It seemed just as we filled up our car, there had been another vehicle that was following ours. She tells me to look in the rearview mirror, and I noticed it as well. I did recognize it, and I do remember seeing it back at the station. I could tell she was feeling a little bit nervous about it, but I just ended up telling her, "Don't worry, honey. I'm sure it's just somebody that needs to go the same way as us. Remember, it's summertime. I know we haven't seen any other cars, but they probably just have to go the same way as us." That seemed to calm her down a little bit. Even with that, I'll admit that I was feeling a little bit uneasy myself. I mean, it's one thing to be driving the same way as us. It's another thing to be driving so close to us. I wasn't sure what their problem was. I just ended up slowing down. I figured that they would get annoyed by this and they would just end up passing us. They never did. They literally stayed right behind us the entire time. Even with their lights, I could see it was one person driving. I wanted to go faster so we could get to the more populated highway area, but even with that, still nothing. Seriously, I had no idea what his problem was. I was already stressed because I had to work early on Monday. If anything, I was getting more annoyed by the minute. After what seemed like an eternity, but more like 10 minutes, we reached the main familiar highway. Thinking he was just a local who was bored, I honestly believed he would have turned down another road and leave. Of course, that didn't happen. He got onto the interstate with us as well. Even here on this highway, it's the same thing. Again, I repeat the process of slowing down, but no dice. Was really hoping we would have seen more cars by now, but still, we're all out here on our own. Alexis's concerns soon turned into frustration, and I could see it on her face. One thing I know from her is not to make her angry. For her to be acting like this, I knew she was serious. Still, we were reminded with not knowing if he had anything with him. You just never know, and you always hear about these sorts of stories. Alexis ended up doing something I never thought about. She pressed the horn, hoping that would act as some sort of distraction. That, or maybe that would display the message that we weren't playing as silly games. Surprisingly, that seemed to have worked. Way to go, Alexis. We watched as he slowed down to the shoulder and turned his lights off. Finally, it seemed that it was all over, but we did find it weird that he would turn the lights off. We take the opportunity to get out of there, and soon we put on some music to get our minds off of it. By this point, we're about 20 minutes away from home. We now saw the familiar sights and were even soon joined by other cars. That made us feel a lot better now. Eventually, we started passing the cars until there was almost nothing. Once again, we're all alone. But something happened that literally surprised us. Remember our mysterious car friend from earlier? Well, just behind us slightly was the same familiar dark car. Suddenly, he turned the headlights on just like that. My best guess was that this entire time, he had been strategically following us with the lights off. He must have just been far enough where we wouldn't have been able to see him. I took one look towards Alexis, and we both sort of just nodded at each other, confirming our assumptions. I could see a larger vehicle ahead of me, and I tried to make my way closer. Ahead of me, I could see a larger vehicle, and that's when I started getting closer to them. After some quick maneuvering and quick thinking, I was able to get around this other car. With this new car, our stranger friend ended up slowing down. I'm pretty sure the person in the other car was able to tell what was going on, because they had stayed there the entire time with us. We did eventually make it into town, but we didn't go home just yet. I wanted to make sure he wasn't following us, because I didn't want him knowing where we were living. After driving around for another 15 minutes, taking various turns and going down dark alleys, we had no longer seen him. Finally, with him gone, we go back home where I immediately put the car in the garage. I ended up calling an officer friend and I explained the entire situation. Honestly, I wasn't sure if there was anything they could do. I never did hear anything back, so I don't think they ever did find him. I don't know why, but in all that time, we hadn't thought about getting the license plate number. I think we were just so caught up with all the commotion that we hadn't thought about that. Number 5. This was a couple of weeks ago. I wanted to do something different for a change. I was living in a small college town, in a dorm that was just off of campus. Apart from studying and events that happened on campus, there was almost nothing to do in the summer. The once joyful and busy school turned into the complete opposite in the summertime. I think most people wanted to spend their summer break at the beach, or maybe even back at home. This put me in an interesting situation. Because I had no reason to go home, I really had nowhere else to go. There were still a few students that stayed over the summer, but for the most part my friends had returned back home. Not that I could really blame them. This left me with really not much to do. Because I was so busy during the semester, studying and working on projects, I hadn't really been able to enjoy one of my favorite pastimes, exploring and adventuring. What I mean by this was I loved to go to these abandoned and lonely places. There is just something so fascinating about them that I absolutely enjoyed. I spent the next couple of days at the library doing some research and looking up the places I could go and find. I ended up finding this one little farm that was off in the woods. It was about an hour from town, but it has you going down these very lonely and old roads. Out here, I can just imagine how little traffic I would find. Still, it sounded like a plan. It could be like my own little road trip. Not the most ideal kind of road trip, but it was one I would soon never forget. I was way too excited to go that I ended up leaving that same night. Looking back, I really do wish I would have gone when there was more sunlight. I follow the way on my phone until I reach a lonely little road that was mentioned on my map. I did notice as I started to get closer to the woods, the road ended up closing off. There was one of those barricades that was stopping me from continuing. Right away, that should have been my sign to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped out of my car and made my way over. It was one of those barricades that had a removable chain. From there, you can push it open and then make your way down the road. I move it, and once I do, I get back in the car and continue. While going down this road, I saw a lot of abandoned cars and old little sheds. I'm guessing this all belonged to the farmer. Finally, after driving another 5 minutes, I reach a small field where I can see a building in the distance. At last, I had found the farm. I can see a barn, a shed, and a windmill. Well, it was true. This place was abandoned. The barn itself showed signs of damage, and it looks like people have been here before in the past. It was a bummer because I wanted to be the first one to explore it. Oh well, what can you do? I drive around the building first to make sure there was nobody around here. I hadn't seen any cars, so I concluded that I was the only one here. From there, I ended up walking over to the field where I would take some pictures. I was able to find this old-looking tractor. I actually sat on the tractor's seat for a few seconds, and I imagined to be the farmer. Brilliant imagination, if I do say so myself. I got bored after about 20 seconds. That was nothing. Now came the exciting part, going inside the barn and seeing what I could find. But first, let me take a picture of the barn. I put the camera up to my face and I proceeded to take a picture. As I'm looking through the lens and take the picture, I saw what I believed was somebody looking at me from behind the barn door. I do a double take as I put the camera down and look, but I don't see anything. I'm guessing my mind was playing tricks on me. I would soon find out that wasn't the case. Disregarding what I thought I saw, I now start making my way over to the barn area. I go over a small little fence, then arrive right at the main entrance. I slowly open the door, and inside I could see it was a mess. There were a bunch of boxes and tools everywhere. Inside, I seriously felt like the temperature had fallen 10 degrees. I got this chill as I slowly started walking in farther. I go to take some more pictures, and in between one of them, I hear the sounds of footsteps. There was a second-story ledge that had a ladder you can climb up to. I froze thinking that somebody else was here, but again, me being naive, I ignored it. Alright, just calm down. You've seen way too many movies. No one is out here but you. Just relax, enjoy this place. That's all I was able to tell myself. Sadly, my curiosity got the best of me. Against everything, I climbed this ladder just to prove to myself there is nothing here. I climb up, and as soon as I do, I'm about to step onto the top floor. That's when I started hearing whispering. In the dark corner, I can see a mattress, and I see a man who just sat there. We met eye to eye, and now he gets up. You can imagine just with that sight, I quickly jump down and get running back to the car. While doing so, I can hear the sounds of him running towards me. Me being the clumsy one, I ended up tripping right before reaching my car. I quickly got up and opened my door, and I start the car. He starts knocking on the window, and I could see the look of anger on his face. He looked old and dirty. My best guess was that he lived out here or something. Regardless, I don't stop until I'm back on the highway, and soon I'm back at my dorm. I know what you're thinking. I should have never gone on my own, but I did. I told my friends about it, and now they're interested in going to check out the place for themselves. I'm definitely not going this time. Oh yeah, I still have the photos if you would love to see them. I'll make sure to put them up so you can see them if you want. Well, hello there. Looks like you made it to the end. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. So tell me, which story was your favorite? Let me know. Also, if you'd love to hear more stories, then make sure you stay tuned. We've got plenty of more exciting audio adventures on the way, and I know you won't want to miss any of it. I know, it's the end of today's adventures, but we'll be back next time. Until then, take care and have an amazing day.